The courtroom in Birmingham was as unremarkable as they came, functional, almost sterile, with pale walls, high ceilings, and an air of quiet authority. It wasn't the kind of place where dramatic revelations or pivotal moments unfolded. Instead, it served as the backdrop for the mundane workings of the legal system, where fines were issued, petty criminals were reprimanded, and the occasional sob story was heard with a raised eyebrow and a dismissive shrug. On this particular day, the room was relatively full. Most of the seats in the public gallery were taken, though the attendees were hardly a lively crowd. A mix of reporters, curious observers, and family members of defendants filled the rows, their collective energy subdued. The faint hum of whispered conversations filled the air, but they ceased as soon as the judge entered the room. Judge Harold Brennan was a seasoned magistrate with decades of experience. His silver hair, sharp suit, and piercing gaze gave him an air of authority that commanded immediate respect. Known for his no-nonsense approach to justice, he had a reputation for moving swiftly through cases, rarely tolerating delays or drawn-out arguments. As he took his seat, he glanced at the docket for the day. It was a typical list: minor offences, a few disputes, and an assortment of fines and community service orders to hand out. Judge Brennan preferred these straightforward cases. They were quick to resolve, leaving no room for ambiguity. Near the top of the list was a case that seemed particularly cut and dry. A young man, Samuel Parker, charged with public disturbance during a protest in the city centre. The charge was routine enough. Participants in protests often found themselves on the wrong side of the law, either for obstructing public pathways or for clashing with the police. This case, the judge assumed, would be no different. As Samuel was called to stand before the bench, the judge's eyes scanned the man before him. Samuel was in his late 20s, with an unkempt appearance. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his shoes scuffed, and his posture awkward. He seemed nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Judge Brennan made a mental note: another young protester who didn't understand the importance of respecting the law. He'd seen dozens of them before, idealistic, headstrong, and convinced they could challenge authority without consequences. The prosecutor began to outline the case. Your Honour, on the evening of the 14th, Mr. Parker was part of a demonstration in the city centre. The protest, which began peacefully, eventually led to the obstruction of public pathways. When instructed by law enforcement to disperse, Mr. Parker refused to comply. His actions contributed to the disruption of traffic and public services. Judge Brennan nodded as he listened, his expression neutral but firm. Mr. Parker, he said, his voice steady and authoritative, do you understand the charges against you? Yes, Your Honour, Samuel replied, his voice quiet but steady. And how do you plead? Guilty, Your Honour. The judge raised an eyebrow. It was rare for defendants in such cases to plead guilty without attempting to justify their actions. He had expected a long-winded explanation about the cause Samuel was protesting for, a speech about the importance of standing up for what one believes in. Instead, the young man had admitted his guilt without hesitation. Well, the judge began, leaning forward slightly, at least you're honest. But that doesn't excuse your actions. Protests, while a vital part of a democratic society, must be conducted in a manner that respects the rights of others. Disrupting public order is not the way to make your voice heard. Samuel nodded, but he remained silent. His lack of response seemed almost defiant to the judge, though it wasn't accompanied by the usual arrogance he often saw in such defendants. Do you have anything to say in your defense, Mr. Parker? Samuel hesitated, glancing down at his hands for a moment before looking up at the judge. Only that my intentions weren't to cause harm or disruption, Your Honour. I was standing up for something I believe in. The judge's lips tightened. Beliefs don't excuse breaking the law. Intentions are not a shield against the consequences of your actions. He paused, glancing at the young man's file. Given your plea and the circumstances of the case, I see no reason to delay this matter further. A fine of £500 is imposed, along with 30 hours of community service. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signalling the end of the proceedings. But before the next case could be called, Samuel spoke up. Your Honour, he said, his voice calm but firm, may I address the court? The judge looked up, clearly annoyed. He disliked when defendants tried to extend proceedings unnecessarily, especially after a ruling had been made. But there was something in Samuel's tone that gave him pause, something measured and deliberate. "You may speak, but make it brief," Judge Brennan said, folding his hands in front of him. Samuel took a deep breath. "I appreciate the court's decision, Your Honor, but I believe it's important to provide context. While I accept the fine and the community service, I feel it's necessary to clarify that my actions weren't just about a cause, they were about defending the rights of those who don't have a voice." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical but curious. "Go on," he said. And that was when the atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. As Samuel continued, his nervousness seemed to dissipate. His words grew more articulate, his arguments more compelling. He spoke of the marginalized communities he had been protesting for, the systemic issues they faced, and the lack of attention these issues received from those in power. The judge frowned slightly. There was a sharpness to Samuel's words now, a precision that didn't match the scruffy appearance and nervous demeanor he had presented earlier. It was almost as if the young man had been holding back, waiting for the right moment to reveal who he truly was. By the time Samuel finished his initial statement, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge, who had been prepared to dismiss the case as a routine disturbance, found himself intrigued. There was something more to this young man, something he hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Parker," the judge said slowly, his tone more measured now, "you seem to have a deep understanding of the issues you're speaking about. May I ask what your background is?" Samuel paused for a moment, then replied, "I'm a barrister, Your Honor. I specialize in human rights law." The judge's expression froze for a moment, and a murmur rippled through the courtroom. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone in the room waited to see how the judge would respond to this unexpected revelation. The revelation struck the courtroom like a thunderclap. Judge Harold Brennan's pen paused mid-sentence, hovering above the notes he was scribbling. For a few seconds he remained frozen, his sharp eyes fixed on Samuel Parker. A barrister, specializing in human rights law? The young man who had stood before him moments ago, disheveled and seemingly unremarkable, was not the defendant Judge Brennan had imagined. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder as the audience tried to make sense of what had just been said. Reporters leaned forward eagerly, their pens flying across their notepads. Even the court clerk glanced up from her files, eyebrows raised in surprise. Judge Brennan cleared his throat, an attempt to regain control of the room and, perhaps, his own composure. "Order," he commanded, his voice cutting through the whispers. The murmurs died down, but "Mr. Parker," the judge began, his tone a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. "Did I hear you correctly? You are a practicing barrister?" "Yes, Your Honor," Samuel replied, his voice steady. His earlier nervousness had completely evaporated. He stood tall now, his posture straight and confident. "I was called to the bar 3 years ago. I specialize in cases involving human rights violations and systemic injustice." The judge's gaze narrowed as he processed this new information. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And yet, here you are, standing before this court as a defendant, charged with disrupting public order. One might find that ironic, wouldn't you agree?" Samuel allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps, Your Honor. But the law isn't always a perfect instrument. Sometimes breaking it is the only way to shine a light on its flaws." The gallery erupted into hushed murmurs again, and the judge's gavel came down with a resounding crack. "I will not tolerate disruptions," Judge Brennan snapped, his voice firm. Once the room had settled, he turned his attention back to Samuel. "So, Mr. Parker," he said, his tone laced with skepticism, "you claim that your actions were motivated by a higher purpose. Tell me then, what exactly was so important that it justified breaking the law?" Samuel's gaze didn't waver. "I was protesting the unlawful eviction of asylum seekers, Your Honor. Families who were thrown out of their homes with nowhere to go. Children who are now sleeping on the streets because the system deemed them expendable. The demonstration was meant to draw attention to their plight, to demand accountability from those in power. It wasn't just a protest, it was a call for humanity." For a moment, the judge didn't respond. He tapped his pen against the desk, his eyes boring into Samuel's. There was a flicker of something, was it doubt, in his otherwise impasse. The expression. Mr. Parker, Judge Brennan said slowly, while your cause may be noble, this court is not concerned with the morality of your actions. My role is to uphold the law, and the law requires that public order be maintained. You admit to disrupting that order, and for that, you must face the consequences. I understand, Your Honor, Samuel replied. But if I may, I believe this court has a duty to consider the context of my actions. The law exists to protect people, does it not? To ensure justice is served. What justice is there in allowing families to be discarded like refuse? What protection is there for children sleeping in the cold? The judge's jaw tightened. He was not used to being challenged in his courtroom, least of all by a defendant. Yet Samuel's words carried a weight that was hard to dismiss. They were not the defiant ramblings of a young idealist, but the measured arguments of a legal mind well versed in the very system Judge Brennan had dedicated his life to. The prosecutor, sensing the judge's hesitation, interjected. Your Honor, while Mr. Parker's sentiments may be compelling, they do not absolve him of his actions. The facts are clear. He participated in a demonstration that disrupted public order, and he refused to comply with law enforcement directives. His profession or motivations are irrelevant to the charges before this court. Agreed, the judge said, though his tone lacked its usual conviction. He turned back to Samuel. Do you have anything further to say in your defense, Mr. Parker? Samuel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. If I may, Your Honor, I'd like to share a brief story. The judge raised an eyebrow but gestured for him to proceed. Samuel took a deep breath. Several months ago, I represented a young boy named Ahmed in an asylum case. He was 7 years old, separated from his family during the chaos of fleeing a war zone. When he arrived in the UK, he was placed in temporary housing. It wasn't much, just a small room in a shared building, but it was a roof over his head. He started school, made friends, and began to rebuild his life. But then, the funding for his housing ran out. The property owner demanded that he leave. Ahmed had nowhere to go, no family to take him in. He spent weeks sleeping in a shelter until he was found by social services. By the time I met him, he was severely malnourished and suffering from trauma. His case was one of many, part of a pattern of neglect and systemic failure. Samuel's voice grew steadier as he continued. Ahmed's story is not unique, Your Honor. It's the story of countless asylum seekers who are treated as burdens rather than human beings. The protest I participated in was not about making noise or causing trouble. It was about demanding that we do better as a society. If standing up for Ahmed and others like him makes me a criminal, then so be it. But I cannot in good conscience remain silent. The courtroom was deathly silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing, their pens hovering above their notepads. Judge Brennan leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. Mr. Parker, he said after a long pause, while your story is undoubtedly moving, this court is bound by the rule of law. The law must be applied equally to all, regardless of their intentions or circumstances. Samuel nodded. I understand, Your Honor. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm simply asking this court to consider the humanity behind the law. To remember that its purpose is not just to punish, but to protect. The judge's expression softened, though only slightly. You've given me much to think about, Mr. Parker, he said. But the fact remains that you broke the law. The question now is what, if any, leniency this court should grant you. As the judge leaned back in his chair, deep in thought, the gallery remained silent. For the first time in years, Judge Harold Brennan found himself questioning the very principles he had sworn to uphold. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, the kind that seems to stretch across eternity. Judge Harold Brennan sat at the bench, his hands clasped, his brow furrowed in a rare display of contemplation. Samuel Parker's words had struck a chord, though the judge tried not to let it show. Brennan was a man of the law, guided by precedents, statutes, and the strict adherence to justice. Yet for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of something he couldn't quite place, an intangible pull toward the humanity behind the rules he was bound to uphold. The prosecutor cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. Your Honor, he began, while the defendant's narrative is compelling, it does not mitigate the fact that he deliberately disrupted public order. Allowing his actions to go unchecked sets a dangerous precedent. The law must remain impartial, regardless of personal motivations. The judge's sharp gaze snapped to the prosecutor. "Thank you for the reminder, Mr. Collins," he said curtly, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Brennan returned his focus to Samuel. The young barrister stood as steady as a pillar, his eyes meeting the judge's with quiet determination. Samuel's voice had not wavered, but inwardly he felt the creeping tension of the moment. He knew the risks of taking this stance, of challenging the very system he'd pledged to uphold as a lawyer. Yet, as he looked around the courtroom, he saw more than just walls and spectators. He saw a microcosm of the society he was fighting for a blend, of privilege and struggle, of those who upheld the rules and those who suffered beneath them. "I ask for the court's leniency not for myself," Samuel said, his voice breaking the silence, "but for the principle that justice must consider context. Punishing me may uphold the letter of the law, but it ignores its spirit. The law should not be a blunt instrument. It should be a beacon of fairness." The gallery erupted into murmurs again, and the judge's gavel struck hard against the bench. "Order!" he barked, though his command carried an undertone of weariness. He could feel the courtroom's energy shifting, the invisible tide turning in response to Samuel's eloquence. Brennan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his mind churned with doubt. The courtroom clerk approached and whispered something into the judge's ear, her voice too low for anyone else to hear. Brennan nodded briskly and dismissed her with a wave of his hand. Turning his attention back to Samuel, he tapped his pen against the bench, the steady rhythm betraying his inner conflict. "Mr. Parker," the judge began, his tone measured, "do you believe that the ends always justify the means?" Samuel tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "No, Your Honor," he replied, "but I believe that when the system fails to address gross injustices, it is our moral obligation to act even if that means stepping outside the boundaries of the law. Sometimes, the means are the only way to shine a light on the failure itself." "Convenient argument," the prosecutor interjected, his tone sharp. "You're asking this court to condone law-breaking as a form of protest. If everyone followed that logic, chaos would ensue. The law exists precisely to prevent such disorder." Samuel turned to face the prosecutor, his calm demeanor unshaken. "And what happens, Mr. Collins, when the law itself perpetuates disorder? When it upholds policies that leave children homeless and families destitute? Are we to remain silent, complicit, in that injustice? Or do we have a duty to speak out, to demand better?" The prosecutor scoffed. "Idealism doesn't excuse criminal behavior." "Enough," Judge Brennan said, raising a hand to silence them both. He fixed Samuel with a piercing stare. "Mr. Parker, you've made your case. But tell me this, if you were in my position, bound by the same rules and precedents, what would you do?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Samuel hesitated. "With respect, Your Honor," he began carefully, "I don't envy your position. It's a difficult balance upholding the law while considering its impact on real lives. But I believe that even within the confines of the law, there is room for compassion. Room to interpret its purpose in a way that aligns with justice, not just punishment." The judge's expression remained impassive, but Samuel could see the gears turning in his mind. The gallery was deathly quiet now, every eye fixed on the two men at the center of the courtroom drama. Even the reporters seemed to hold their breath, their pens poised but motionless. The prosecutor, sensing the judge's hesitation, doubled down. "Your Honor, if I may, this case is about more than Mr. Parker. It's about maintaining the integrity of the judicial system. If we allow personal motivations to override the rule of law, we set a dangerous precedent. The defendant's actions, however noble he claims them to be, were illegal. The law must be upheld." "And what about the precedent we set when we ignore the reasons behind those actions?" Samuel countered, his voice rising slightly. "What message do we send to the most vulnerable in our society when we punish those who stand up for them? That their suffering is invisible, that their voices don't matter." The integrity of the judicial system should be measured not just by its adherence to the law, but by its ability to deliver true justice. Judge Brennan held up a hand, silencing them both. "This is not a debate," he said firmly, though the edge in his voice had softened. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze boring into Samuel's. "You've given this court a great deal to consider, Mr. Parker. But understand this. Me decision will not be swayed by rhetoric or sentimentality. It will be based on the facts and the law." Samuel nodded, his face calm but his heart pounding. He had said everything he could, laid his arguments bare. The rest was out of his hands. The judge rose from his seat, signaling a brief recess. The gallery erupted into whispers as he disappeared through a door behind the bench, leaving the courtroom in a state of suspended animation. Reporters huddled together, speculating on the outcome. The prosecutor busied himself with his notes, while Samuel sat quietly at the defendant's table, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. As the minutes ticked by, Samuel's resolve hardened. No matter the judge's decision, he knew he had done the right thing. He had spoken for those who couldn't speak for themselves, challenged a system that too often ignored their plight. And if that meant facing consequences, he would do so with his head held high. When Judge Brennan returned, the room fell silent once more. His expression was unreadable as he resumed his seat, his eyes scanning the courtroom before settling on Samuel. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and in that fleeting exchange, Samuel thought he saw a glimmer of understanding, or was it respect? "Mr. Parker," the judge began, his voice measured but firm. "This court has reached a decision." The rest of the judge's words were drowned out in Samuel's mind as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Whatever the outcome, he knew that this day would mark a turning point, not just for him, but for the conversation he had fought so hard to ignite. The courtroom buzz. They said with anticipation as Judge Harold Brennan paused, his gaze sweeping the room. It was a deliberate pause, one meant to reinforce the gravity of the decision he was about to render. For Judge Brennan, this was more than just another case on the docket. It was a moment of reckoning not just for Samuel Parker, but for himself, for the court, and perhaps even for the law. He drew in a deep breath, his voice measured and steady as he began. This court is tasked with interpreting the law, but also with recognizing the human lives affected by its application. Mr. Parker has made compelling arguments today, arguments that speak not just to the circumstances of this case, but to the broader responsibilities we bear as arbiters of justice. The words hung in the air like an ominous fog, and Samuel's heart thudded in his chest. He had prepared himself for this moment, steeled his nerves for the possibility of an unfavorable outcome, but the weight of the judge's words bore down on him nonetheless. "Mr. Parker," Brennan continued, his voice unwavering, "your actions, while grounded in noble intentions, cannot simply be excused. The law exists to ensure order, and no individual, regardless of motive, can operate above it." However, the judge paused, allowing the murmurs in the gallery to fade. It is also the role of this court to ensure that the punishment fits the crime. The shift in the judge's tone was subtle, but undeniable. Samuel sat straighter in his chair, his breath caught in his throat. Even the prosecutor, who had appeared smug and assured throughout the trial, now seemed uneasy. "Before I deliver the court's verdict," Judge Brennan said, "there is a matter that cannot be ignored. Mr. Parker has made claims about the housing crisis that led to his actions. The prosecution has argued that these claims are irrelevant, yet the defendant's statements point to systemic issues that go beyond the scope of this case. As such, I have instructed the clerk to investigate these allegations further." There was a collective intake of breath from the courtroom. This was unexpected. Judges rarely deviated from the confines of the case at hand, and for Brennan to do so spoke volumes. Samuel, though surprised, felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps his words had resonated more deeply than he had realized. Judge Brennan continued, his tone now softer, but no less firm. "This court has reviewed the records, and it is clear that the housing policies enforced in the district have resulted in significant displacement. Families, children, and individuals have been left without recourse. These findings do not absolve you of your actions, Mr. Parker, but they do provide context that this court cannot, in good conscience, ignore." The gallery erupted into whispers, and the judge's gavel struck sharply against the bench. "Order!" he commanded, his voice slicing through the noise. When silence fell once more, Brennan turned his attention back to Samuel. "You are a lawyer, Mr. Parker," he said. "You understand the weight of responsibility that comes with that title. Yet you chose to disregard the legal channels available to you, opting instead for direct action. While I do not condone your methods, I must acknowledge the courage it took to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves." Samuel's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the judge. He could feel the room's collective attention pressing down on him, the expectations of every spectator and reporter hanging on the judge's next words. "Therefore," Brennan said, his voice firm but tinged with something almost imperceptible, was it compassion? "This court sentences you to 30 days of community service, to be carried out at the very shelters and organizations you sought to defend." The courtroom erupted into noise once again, a cacophony of shock, relief, and indignation. Samuel's shoulders sagged as the tension drained from his body. Community service. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was far from the outcome he had feared. The prosecutor's face was a mask of frustration, his carefully prepared arguments now rendered moot. He leaned toward the judge, clearly intending to protest, but Brennan silenced him with a single raised hand. "This decision is final," the judge said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And let it be clear that this court expects Mr. Parker to fulfill his sentence with the same dedication he has shown in his defense." Samuel stood, his legs slightly unsteady beneath him. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling within him. "I will not let you down." As the court adjourned, Samuel felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. Reporters swarmed him as he exited the courthouse, their questions flying like arrows. "Mr. Parker, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you believe this will set a precedent for other activists? What's next for you?"